This video is supported by Galder's Gazetteer, a 5e expansion for advanced players. Quick disclosure, I watched the Briarwood arc live. I am a fan. But I was still prepared, maybe even expecting, for the Vox Machina cartoon to suck. But it doesn't. It's great. It beautifully showcases a lot of what I really love about the hobby, with heart and authenticity that's so rare in mainstream media. And I am a bit jealous. Not just that Matt Mercer got his campaign made into a cartoon, but that the whole table got a second chance at it. They essentially got the chance to replay a part of their campaign and say, let's do it again, but better. Luckily, we as dungeon masters and players can still learn from their second pass. We can use this idealized D&D game to heighten our actual D&D game. And in this video, we're gonna look at one element that I really think is instructional. We're gonna look at how the Vox Machina finale encouraged roleplay through combat. D&D is weird in that rolling initiative is definitely a transition. It's not quite as stark as Final Fantasy, but there is definitely this element that what you're doing now is different than what you were doing before. And I think because of that, there's this ongoing fear that once you're in combat, because it's so different, everything else gets pushed aside. Some might say, of course there's roleplay in combat. It's a role-playing game. And I have heard, and I'm sure you have too, the maxim that roleplay doesn't stop when initiative is rolled. But what I want to point out is that there is a difference between the typical character dialogue in a tavern versus in a battlefield, and that needn't be the case. But not a lot of focus is put onto how to make that happen. And when roleplay and combat is discussed, I think the most effective technique is often missed. There are of course a few common ways and tips to get more roleplay in combat. You can encourage chatter between the characters, trade insults or taunts with the baddies. You can have the players describe their actions in combat and narrate the results. Or you can have the villain deliver their monologue during the fight rather than before it. All those examples are good and fun, but we're gonna take it to the next level. All those examples are essentially banter, which is different than roleplay as character-driven drama. What about that character's personality and relationships are going to be challenged and changed? What internal conflict is going to come out as a result of this fight? In other words, in order to have roleplay in your combat, you have to have dramatic stakes in your combats. During your fights, you have to have something to roleplay about. In The Legend of Vox Machina, the main plot itself is filled with juicy drama. An evil vampire takes over the city, and the heroes lead a brave resistance to restore hope and justice. The adventure's plot reaches its climax when the hero fights the villain. And that is pretty normal for a D&D game. Just like in an action movie, most of the time the plot reaches its conclusion through combat. The heroes beat up the villain and in effect stop their evil plan. The story's plot gets resolved. In a typical D&D game, that one facet of narrative importance, the plot getting resolved, happens all the time through combat. What I think is atypical is a character's arc and their personal story also getting resolved through combat. And that's what we want to do. That's the secret. To really crank up that investment and engagement by your players, what you want to do is marry those moments of highest character uncertainty, what will this character do and why, to the moments of highest mechanical uncertainty. Is this random dice roll going to permanently end the game? In the Vox Machina cartoon, the fight down the ziggurat was an excellent example of how, aside from the main plot, individual character development was progressed through the final battle. There were a few different types of character drama that arose in the events leading up to the finale, and they got resolved in different ways in the final fight. In the cartoon, this involved a lot of dialogue, but in a real game, that's going to be roleplay. Conflict between characters in a party can be a rich source of dramatic tension. As long as it's not detrimental to group cohesion, it can add a new layer to roleplay at your table. A great way to ensure that the in-group fighting doesn't split the party is to make sure the characters at the center of the disagreement have a bond that's stronger. Vex and Vax were at odds. Vex noticed the crush on Keyleth and started to get jealous. More than jealous, she was starting to wonder what it would be like if they were actually apart. That fear and jealousy was bubbling beneath the surface and turning into resentment. It was hurting her. Then, in the final fight, she has to hurt him back. When Vax was charmed by Silas, Vex really was confronted with what it would feel like if they really were enemies, and she hated it. Even worse, she caught a brief glimpse of what it would be like if he were gone. So now, even if Vax's relationship with Kiki weren't put on pause, or when it starts up again, I wouldn't be surprised if Vex re-examines how she feels as a result of that fight. The lesson here is to be cognizant of what tensions are developing between your player characters, or create your own, and then use a combat to bring them to a head. Are there conflicting goals? Create a combat where there's a dilemma where only one can be achieved. Get the magic book or rescue the NPC. Is there a disagreement about moral beliefs? Make them incompatible in order to achieve the best outcome. One player goes for the trolley lever while another player guards it. And all the while there's a troll attacking. Whatever the case, the key part is by having that inner character friction erupt as a result of how the fight is designed, forces those characters to work out that difference quickly during the combat. In Vox Machina, there's a great example of an inner party threat. There is something lurking that is poised to destroy the party from within. This has the makings of a good conflict because it pits two virtues, self-preservation and loyalty, against each other. This is really useful for a chosen one narrative, using a cursed item, or if you have a warlock in the party. In Vox Machina, we kind of get all three in a way, because the smoke demon wasn't just a threat to Percy, it was a danger to the entire group. At first, Vox Machina was willing to go the distance with Percy in order to avenge his family. However, soon it's clear that the lengths Percy was willing to go to get his revenge had put them all in grave peril. There's a lot of tension around his evasiveness, his outright deceit, and recklessness. But that is all countered by his friends' showing of their devotion and care. In order to get this effect in your game, what you as a DM need to do is have your group slowly realize the danger throughout the adventure, and then have it release its threat at the boss fight. That way any anger, resentment, or fear that one character endangering the whole group brought, all that emotional baggage needs to be dealt with at the worst possible time. While there's already tension from the fight, you can layer in another dimension of tension, and then ask the characters, how do you feel? This may be obvious, but players and DMs view the game differently. While DMs mostly see the game in terms of plot and setting, players view the game mostly through their characters. So for a player, things that are specifically important to a character, especially if they are created by that player, are going to have the greatest significance in the game. And in my experience, backstory fits this bill most of all. A created character's first motivation, and often the only one that they contribute to the story, is often from their backstory. It's a great insight into what that player wants to do in the game. And it's this connection between the player's contribution to the story and the adventure's overall plot that adds emotional depth to the boss fight. The Briarwood arc expertly draws on Percy's backstory and adds in all the trimmings of an archetypical gothic tragedy. The player wanted to have a satisfying tale of revenge. That's why they wrote it in their backstory. So by presenting them the option to tell that story, of course they're going to jump on it. When a player is face to face with the object that will resolve their backstory, that usually triggers a roleplay moment. They wanted their character to feel a certain way about something. By putting that something in the fiction in front of the player, you're giving them the opportunity to express how they feel about it. So by having the triggering moment occur in combat, that's where the roleplay is going to happen. Some players, and there's nothing wrong with this, but some players are really casual with their characters. They are content to play a stock role and are motivated to pursue a straightforward goal. They are satisfied by playing a static character. But what I like to do, and what I encourage my players to do in IDM, is to create dynamic characters. A character with an arc, with a personality that's going to change from the beginning of the adventure to the end. The entire series, Keyleth had been struggling with self-doubt. As a character, she is weighed down by the enormity of her income and responsibility. Her lack of confidence not only affects how she views herself, but how the entire group sees her. But then, she has a moment to be awesome. As a DM, you should work on training yourself to see these moments when they arise and highlight them for the rest of the table. Keyleth, who has long asked herself, am I good enough? Can I do it? Prepares to unleash the sun on the vampire. In this way, you're almost prompting that player to make a statement, to emote through their character while the stakes are highest. And by pointing out to the other players that this character is having a moment, it's a great way to prime them to support it. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about why tragic villains are great to use, mostly because I already have a whole video on this subject. But I do want to talk a bit about how they can be used to encourage roleplay. And while all villains need a goal that's understandable, what makes the Briarwood's motivation compelling is that it's relatable. Who couldn't sympathize with loving another so deeply you'd do anything for them? It's not necessarily what they desire that's wrong, it's what they're willing to do to get it. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, a villain's monologue is a staple of heroic fiction, and you'd be remiss if you didn't include them gloating or explaining their motivations and plans. However, unlike a purely evil or insane villain, a sympathetic villain allows the heroes to reflect on their own beliefs and values. So for Dungeon Masters, the trick is to break down your sympathetic villain's monologue into smaller chunks of dialogue that can be delivered each turn. That way, all the players have an opportunity to respond to what's being said. For the players to point out the recklessness, cruelty, or selfishness that prevents the villain's actions from possibly being seen in a good light. To point out, in character, the difference from what the heroes believe or have come to believe and what the villain is doing. It's likely that by the time your players reach the final confrontation, they'll likely have a strong idea of what they can expect from the villain's personality. But it can certainly be the case that the true reason behind the villain's actions aren't revealed until the very end. Throwing in a tragic twist, or two, can catch the players off guard, and having to confront the truth with little time to prepare gives the truest reaction. And when people are surprised or excited, they're likely to just blurt things out. And that is what we're after. That spontaneous exclamation when the player is fully immersed in what the character is feeling in the fiction. That's the height of roleplay. We gotta get it in our games. Yeah, that's it. That's the video, folks. The Vox Machina series ended just 6 days ago. I was really inspired. I wrote the script in a flurry, and I hope you liked it. If you liked the vid, please consider buying my book, Galder's Gazetteer. This expansion for advanced players is centered around new conditions, actions, and martial options. Those new rules are fully incorporated into subclasses, variant classes, ancestries. There's also a whole GM toolkit and 2 one-shot adventures to help you use these new rules right away. And 100% of the proceeds are donated to the Cancer Research Institute. Cool book, great cause, link below. You could also support the channel through my $1 Patreon, where I have dozens of streams about game design, interviews, and prepping for my home game. Tons of content, just $1, easy way to support the channel. The other way, of course, is to like, subscribe, and to let me know your thoughts on Critical Role, Vox Machina, and Roleplay Through Combat in the comments below.